The crystal chandeliers of the Grand Plaza Hotel's ballroom sparkled like fresh snow as Richard Wellington surveyed the Christmas wedding preparations with meticulous attention. At 62, the self-made real estate mogul had orchestrated countless million-dollar deals, but nothing compared to the pressure of ensuring his only daughter's perfect Christmas wedding. His steel-gray eyes scrutinized every detail, from the hand-carved ice sculptures to the imported white roses that adorned each table. "Mr. Wellington, the string quartet is asking about the processional music changes." His personal assistant Marcus approached with an iPad in hand. "And the chef needs final approval on the champagne selection." Richard waved his hand dismissively. "Tell them whatever Emily wants, she gets. This has to be perfect." His voice carried the weight of a man determined to give his daughter the fairy tale wedding she deserved, especially after everything they'd been through since losing her mother to cancer 15 years ago. But perfection, as Richard would soon learn, was a fragile illusion. As he adjusted his Italian silk tie, Emily burst into the ballroom, her face pale despite her usual rosy complexion. The sight of his daughter, normally so composed and elegant, in such distress, made his heart skip a beat. Her designer wedding dress fitting had been scheduled for this morning, and she should have been glowing with excitement. "Dad, we need to talk." Emily's voice trembled. "Privately." Richard felt the familiar tightening in his chest that preceded every major crisis in his business career. He followed Emily to a quiet corner of the ballroom, away from the bustling wedding planners and staff. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" He reached for her hand, noticing how cold and clammy it felt. Emily's green eyes, so much like her mother's, filled with tears. "I can't marry James," she whispered, her words hitting Richard like a physical blow. "What? But the wedding is in 3 days. Everything is arranged. The guests are flying in from around the world." Richard struggled to keep his voice steady, aware of the curious glances from the staff. "There's something you don't know," Emily continued, her voice barely audible. "Something I've been hiding from everyone, especially James." Richard's mind raced through possibilities: cold feet, pre-wedding jitters, or perhaps some disagreement with her fiancé. But nothing prepared him for what came next. "I'm pregnant," Emily said, her words hanging in the air like icicles. "And James, he's not the father." The world seemed to tilt on its axis as Richard processed her words. His daughter, his perfect, accomplished Emily, was carrying another man's child while preparing to marry into one of Boston's most prominent families. "Who?" The question escaped his lips before he could stop it. Emily's next words made his blood run cold. "Michael Crawford." Richard's grip on the nearby chair tightened until his knuckles turned white. Michael Crawford, the young executive he'd personally mentored at his company, the man he'd trusted with sensitive business dealings, the person he'd treated like a son. "How long?" Richard managed to ask, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. 6 months, Emily replied, her voice steadying despite the tears streaming down her face. "It started after that charity gala in June. We never meant for it to happen, but..." Richard's mind flashed back to that evening, the summer charity event where he'd proudly introduced James as Emily's fiancé to his business associates. All while Michael, his protégé, had been there, smiling and congratulating the couple. The betrayal cut deep, not just personally but professionally. Michael Crawford had access to sensitive information about Wellington Enterprises' upcoming merger, a deal that could reshape the entire East Coast real estate market. If this scandal broke, it wouldn't just destroy Emily's reputation, it could potentially tank the company's stock and derail years of careful planning. "Does James know?" Richard asked, already calculating the potential fallout. Emily shook her head. "No one knows except Michael, and now you." Richard pulled out his phone, his fingers hovering over Michael's contact information. The young executive was supposed to be in New York, finalizing crucial details of the merger. "Don't!" Emily grabbed his arm. "Please, Dad, I need time to figure this out." But Richard was already seeing the bigger picture, The press headlines, the whispers at board meetings, the gleeful competitors who would love to see Wellington Enterprises stumble. Everything he'd built, everything he'd protected, was suddenly balanced on a knife's edge. 3 days, he muttered, more to himself than to Emily. We have 3 days until the wedding. The sound of laughter from the hallway made them both turn. James had arrived early, his tall figure visible through the ballroom's glass doors. He was chatting with the wedding planner, completely unaware that his perfect Christmas wedding was about to unravel. Richard looked at his daughter, seeing not just the accomplished woman she'd become, but the little girl who used to climb into his lap after nightmares, seeking comfort and solutions. He'd always been able to fix everything for her. But this required more than money or influence could solve. Go to the bridal suite, he instructed Emily, his voice low and controlled. Tell James you're reviewing the final dress alterations. I need to make some calls. As Emily hurried away, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue, Richard Wellington stood alone in his carefully orchestrated winter wonderland. The ice sculptures were beginning to melt, tiny droplets falling like tears onto the pristine white tablecloths. His phone buzzed, a message from Michael Crawford. Need to discuss urgent matters regarding the merger. Can we meet tonight? Richard stared at the message, his jaw clenching. Michael had no idea that his secret was out, that his carefully planned deception was about to collapse. But Richard knew something that neither Michael nor Emily had considered. There was more at stake here than just a wedding. What would you do if you discovered a secret that could destroy your family's happiness just before Christmas? Share your opinion in the comments and let us know what decision you would make in Richard's place. The December wind howled outside Richard Wellington's office windows as he sat in his leather chair, phone pressed to his ear. The city lights twinkled below like fallen stars, but his mind was focused on the crisis at hand. Cancel my meetings for the next 3 days, he instructed his secretary, and get me everything we have on Michael Crawford's activities for the past 6 months. Everything. The sun had set hours ago, but Richard hadn't noticed. On his desk lay spread the various security reports he'd quietly commissioned over the years, background checks on James, his future son-in-law going back a decade. He'd thought he'd been thorough, protecting Emily from any potential threats to her happiness. Yet somehow he'd missed the threat within his own company. A soft knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. Come in, he called, expecting Emily. Instead, Margaret Chen, his head of legal affairs, entered with a thick folder. You wanted the merger documents, she said, her expression grave. Richard, is everything all right? Pushing this deal through before Christmas was your idea, and now I hear you're cancelling meetings? Richard gestured for her to sit. For her. Margaret had been with the company for 20 years. She was one of the few people he truly trusted. What I'm about to tell you doesn't leave this room, he began. As he explained the situation, Margaret's usual composed expression gave way to shock. Michael Crawford, she whispered. The same Michael Crawford who's been handling the sensitive negotiations with East Coast Properties. The very same, Richard confirmed, his voice bitter. Margaret leaned forward, her legal mind already analyzing angles. Richard, this isn't just about the wedding. Crawford has been our point person on the merger. He knows everything, our vulnerabilities, our leverage points, even the shell companies we set up to handle the more delicate aspects of the acquisition. Richard's blood ran cold. He hadn't even considered that angle. Michael Crawford wasn't just the man who'd betrayed his daughter's trust. He was also potentially the biggest threat to Wellington Enterprises' future. There's more, Margaret added, pulling a document from her folder. I was reviewing the recent transactions. There have been some unusual patterns in Crawford's dealings, small inconsistencies that wouldn't raise flags individually, but together. She spread several papers across his desk, pointing to highlighted figures. He's been meeting with representatives from our competitors. Officially, it's about standard industry matters, but the timing. He's been playing both sides, Richard realized, the pieces falling into place. using his position here to gather information while setting up his next move. If he decides to go public with any of this, Margaret left the sentence hanging. Richard stood walking to the window. Below, Christmas lights decorated the streets, creating a festive atmosphere that felt mockingly cheerful. His phone buzzed again. Another message from Michael. "Mr. Wellington, it's urgent. The East Coast team is pushing for answers. We need to meet." A plan began forming in Richard's mind. "Get me everything you can on those meetings Crawford had with our competitors. And Margaret, not a word about Emily's situation. As far as anyone knows, this is purely about business irregularities." Just then, his office door burst open. James, Emily's fiancé, stormed in, his usually perfectly composed face flushed with anger. "Is it true?" he demanded. Richard's heart stopped. "James, what are you—" "The merger," James interrupted. "My father just called. He heard rumors that Wellington Enterprises is planning to back out of our joint venture in the Boston waterfront development. We have hundreds of millions invested in this." Relief flooded through Richard, followed quickly by new concern. James's family's company was a crucial partner in several major developments. The wedding wasn't just joining two people. It was cementing a business alliance years in the making. "James, I assure you," Richard began. But his phone interrupted him. Emily's name flashed on the screen, along with a text that made his stomach drop. "Michael just called. He's coming to the hotel. He says he won't let me go through with the wedding." Margaret, sensing the tension, quietly excused herself. As the door closed behind her, James ran his hands through his hair in frustration. "Richard, what's really going on? First Emily's acting strange, now these rumors, 3 days before the wedding and everything's falling apart." Richard Wellington had built his empire by being able to see 10 moves ahead, by anticipating problems before they arose. But now, watching his carefully constructed plans crumble, he realized he'd overlooked something crucial: the human heart's capacity for chaos. His phone buzzed again. A message from his security team. "Mr. Crawford has entered the building, heading to your floor." Richard looked at James, then at his phone, then at the merger documents spread across his desk. In the next few minutes, 3 separate worlds were about to collide, and he had to decide which pieces to sacrifice to save the whole. The elevator dinged in the hallway outside. "James," Richard said, his voice taking on the same tone he used in his most critical business negotiations, "there's something you need to know. But first, I need you to trust that everything I'm about to do is to protect our families. Both of them." Footsteps approached the office door. Richard moved to his desk, pressing the intercom. "Security, please come to my office immediately." He then turned to face the door, straightening his tie as the handle began to turn. The next few moments would either save everything he'd built or destroy it all. And somewhere in the back of his mind, he heard Emily's words from earlier. "We never meant for it to happen." But in Richard Wellington's experience, it wasn't intentions that mattered. It was consequences, and he was about to make sure everyone understood exactly what those consequences would be. Betrayal hurts the most when it comes from someone you fully trusted. If this story is moving you, give it a like so more people can reflect on the power of trust and its consequences. The office door swung open, and Michael Crawford strode in with the confidence of a man who thought he still held all the cards. His expensive suit and perfectly styled hair painted the picture of success, but Richard noticed the slight tremor in his hands, the barely perceptible sheen of sweat on his forehead. "Mr. Wellington, we need to—" Michael stopped abruptly, registering James's presence. The color drained from his face. "Michael," Richard's voice was deadly calm. "Perfect timing. We were just discussing the future of Wellington Enterprises. Please, join us." Security arrived silently behind Michael, 2 large men in dark suits positioning themselves by the door. The message was clear. No one was leaving until Richard allowed it. "I don't understand." James looked between them, sensing the undercurrent of tension. "What's going on?" Michael took a step forward. "Mr. Wellington, if I could speak with you privately." "No more privacy," Richard cut him off. "No more secrets." He pressed a button on his desk phone. "Send her in." The door opened again, and Emily entered, her face pale but composed. She'd changed from her earlier distress into a mask of forced calm, though her hands clutched her purse like a lifeline. "Emily!" James moved toward her, but stopped when she flinched away. "What's wrong? What's happening?" Richard watched the scene unfold, his heart heavy but his mind sharp. "Show him," he instructed Emily. With trembling hands, Emily opened her purse and withdrew a small white stick, a pregnancy test. James stared at it, uncomprehending at first. Then his eyes widened, darting between Emily and Michael, who had backed against the wall. "No," James whispered. "No, no, no. I'm so sorry." Emily's voice cracked. "I never meant what?" James's voice rose. "To sleep with him, to lie to me, to humiliate me 3 days before our wedding." Michael stepped forward. "James, you don't understand. Emily and I... Mr. Crawford!" Richard's voice cut through the chaos like a steel blade. "I suggest you focus less on your personal drama and more on explaining these." He gestured to the documents Margaret had brought earlier. Michael's expression shifted from personal anguish to professional fear. "Those are confidential business matters." "Yes, they are," Richard agreed. "Specifically, they're records of your meetings with our competitors, meetings where you shared proprietary information about our merger plans." James's head snapped up. "What?" "It seems Mr. Crawford has been hedging his bets," Richard continued, "setting up a safety net in case his position here became complicated." He picked up one of the documents. "Tell me, Michael, did Stellar Development offer you a good price for our secrets?" The room fell silent. Even Emily stopped crying, staring at Michael in shock. "That's not—" "I can explain," Michael stammered. "Oh, you'll explain." Richard stood, his presence filling the room. "You'll explain everything, starting with how you managed to access encrypted files outside your clearance level." Michael's professional facade cracked. "You're trying to destroy me," he accused, "because of Emily. But you can't prove anything about those meetings." "Actually," a new voice joined the conversation as Margaret re-entered the room, tablet in hand, "we can. The SEC is very interested in certain transactions you've been making, particularly the ones through your offshore account in the Cayman Islands." Michael's face went from pale to ashen. "That's impossible. Those accounts were untraceable." "Nothing is untraceable, Mr. Crawford." Richard's voice carried the weight of decades of business warfare. "Did you really think I wouldn't have contingencies, that I wouldn't protect my company, my family, from threats both outside and in?" Emily stepped forward, her voice small but clear. "You were stealing from my father? All this time?" Michael's desperation became visible. "Emily, listen to me. Everything I did was for us. I needed to ensure we'd have a future together. Your father would never have accepted us otherwise." "A future?" Emily's voice rose with incredulity. "You were building our future on theft and lies." James, who had been silent, suddenly laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "Well, you two deserve each other." "James, wait." Emily reached for him, but he jerked away. "Don't touch me," he spat. "My father was right about the Wellingtons. You're all just expensive facades hiding rot." Richard's voice cut through the tension. "James, before you leave, remember that your family's company is still deeply involved in joint ventures with Wellington Enterprises. Ventures that could suffer greatly if this situation becomes public." James froze, understanding the implicit threat. The room crackled with tension as each person realized the full scope of their predicament. Michael, trapped by his own ambition. Emily, facing the consequences of her choices. James, bound by business ties he couldn't easily break. And Richard Wellington, the puppet master, watching it all unfold according to a plan that was forming even as chaos reigned. "So," Richard spoke into the heavy silence, "here's what's going to happen next." But before he could continue, Emily suddenly gasped, clutching her stomach. All eyes turned to her as she swayed on her feet. "Emily!" Richard rushed to his daughter's side as she began to collapse. The stress, The revelations, the weight of it all finally proving too much. As security called for medical help and James instinctively moved to assist despite his anger, Michael tried to approach Emily. Richard's voice stopped him cold. "Don't even think about it, Mr. Crawford. Your role in this story is about to take a very different turn." The last thing Emily saw before darkness claimed her was her father's face, set in grim determination, and she realized that the true consequences of her actions were only beginning to unfold. Do you think Emily should forgive Michael? Or is Richard right to protect his daughter? Subscribe so you don't miss how this intense family drama unfolds and discover its shocking conclusion. The private hospital room was quiet, except for the steady beep of monitors and the soft whisper of snow against the windows. Emily lay sleeping, exhaustion and medication having finally granted her peace. Richard sat beside her bed, his executive demeanor replaced by the worn look of a worried father. The doctor had assured him it was just stress and dehydration. Both mother and baby were fine. The words mother and baby still felt surreal to him. In his mind, Emily was still that little girl who'd crawl into his lap during thunderstorms, not a woman carrying another life within her. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Margaret entered, her usual professional attire somewhat rumpled after hours of crisis management. "Everything's in place," she said quietly, handing him a folder. "Michael Crawford's resignation has been drafted, along with a comprehensive NDA. The evidence of his corporate espionage is enough to ensure his cooperation." Richard nodded, scanning the documents. "And James's family? They've agreed to keep the merger on track, provided we handle this situation discreetly. They're more concerned about their stock prices than their son's broken heart." A bitter smile crossed Richard's face. "Of course they are. We're all the same, aren't we? Building empires on the bones of broken dreams." Margaret's expression softened. "You're nothing like them. Richard, everything you've done has been to protect Emily, has it?" He looked at his sleeping daughter. "Or have I just been protecting myself? My company? My reputation?" Before Margaret could respond, Emily stirred. Her eyes fluttered open, taking a moment to focus on her surroundings. "Dad, I'm here." "Sweetheart." Richard took her hand, noting how small it felt in his, just like when she was a child. "The baby? Everything's fine," he assured her. "You just need rest." Emily's free hand moved to her stomach, a gesture so protective and instinctive it made Richard's throat tighten. "What happened?" Michael, is he?" "Mr. Crawford is being handled," Margaret interjected smoothly. "You don't need to worry about him anymore." Emily's eyes filled with tears. "And James?" Richard exchanged a look with Margaret, who quietly excused herself. Once they were alone, he took a deep breath. "James has agreed to release a joint statement announcing the mutual cancellation of the wedding. The official story will be that you both realized you wanted different things in life." "Different things?" Emily repeated hollowly. "Like honesty, faithfulness?" "Emily, no, Dad, please, I need to say this." She struggled to sit up, her hospital gown crinkling. "All my life, I've tried to be perfect, the perfect daughter, the perfect heiress, the perfect future wife. I was so focused on living up to everyone's expectations that I lost myself somewhere along the way." Richard watched as tears rolled down her cheeks. "When I met Michael, it wasn't about rebellion or excitement. He saw me, not the Wellington heir, not James's fiancée, just me, and for the first time I felt real." "And now?" Richard asked gently. "Now?" Emily laughed bitterly. "Now I know he was just another person seeing what he wanted to see. The wealthy man's daughter, the key to power and position. God, I was so stupid." "You weren't stupid," Richard said firmly. "You were human. We all make mistakes, Emily. The measure of a person isn't in never falling, it's in how they rise afterward." Emily's hand tightened around his. "How do I rise from this, Dad? The wedding is cancelled. My reputation will be in tatters. I'm pregnant with a corporate spy's baby, and I've disappointed everyone who ever believed in me." Richard was quiet for a moment, looking out at the snow falling over the city. Finally, he spoke. "Do you remember the Christmas after your mother died?" Emily nodded, surprise crossing her face at the unexpected question. "I was lost," Richard continued, "drowning in grief and responsibility. You were only 12, but you took my hand and said something I'll never forget. You said, 'Daddy, sometimes we have to let go of the picture of what we thought life would be like and find joy in the story we're living.'" Fresh tears spilled down Emily's cheeks. "Mom used to say that." "Yes, she did. And she was right." Richard turned back to his daughter. "The picture we had, the perfect Christmas wedding, the merger, the society pages, that's gone. But that doesn't mean we can't create something new, something real. But how? The press will have a field day when they learn they won't learn anything we don't want them to know," Richard interrupted. "I've spent decades building walls to protect this family. Trust me, I can handle the press. What I need to know is, what do you want, Emily? Not what you think you should want, not what society expects, but what do you truly want?" Emily was quiet for a long moment, her hand still resting on her stomach. When she spoke, her voice was stronger than before. "I want to keep my baby, and I want to find out who I am without trying to be perfect all the time." Richard nodded, a plan already forming in his mind. "Then that's what we'll do. But first, there's something else we need to discuss." He pulled out his phone, showing her a series of emails. "It seems Mr. Crawford's dealings went deeper than we initially thought, and you need to know the full truth about the man you thought you loved." Emily's eyes widened as she began to read, and Richard watched as the last vestiges of her innocence crumbled in the face of a betrayal far greater than she had imagined. "Sometimes people aren't who we think they are. If you know someone going through a similar situation, share this story with them. It might help them see they're not alone." The morning of what should have been Emily's wedding day dawned clear and cold. Snow blanketed the city in pristine white, as if nature itself was trying to clean away the past week's turmoil. Richard Wellington stood in his office, watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. On his desk lay the final piece of evidence that had shattered any remaining doubts about Michael Crawford's true nature. The emails revealed a conspiracy far more calculated than anyone had suspected. Michael hadn't just been selling company secrets, he'd been orchestrating a hostile takeover attempt of Wellington Enterprises for months. His relationship with Emily wasn't just an affair, it was part of an elaborate scheme to gain control of the company through marriage or scandal. The pregnancy, though unplanned, had merely accelerated his timeline. But Michael's carefully laid plans had one fatal flaw. He'd underestimated Richard Wellington's capacity for both love and ruthlessness when it came to protecting his family. The door opened, and Margaret entered with the morning papers. "It's done," she said, spreading them across his desk. Each headline told the same story. "Wellington-Pierce wedding cancelled by mutual decision," and "Young couple chooses personal growth over society's expectations." The story they'd crafted was elegant in its simplicity. Two young people realizing they needed time to find themselves before committing to marriage. No hint of scandal, no suggestion of impropriety. Just a mature decision that society would readily accept and soon forget. "And Crawford?" Richard asked, though he already knew the answer. "On his way to Shanghai," Margaret confirmed. The evidence of his corporate espionage was enough to convince him that a long-term position with our Asian subsidiary was his best option. "He'll be closely monitored, of course, and the terms of his separation agreement are comprehensive." Richard nodded, appreciating the elegant brutality of it. Michael Crawford would spend the next 5 years effectively exiled, his career and movements controlled by Wellington Enterprises. Any attempt to contact Emily or reveal the truth would result in immediate legal action and professional destruction. "Have you told Emily?" "Not yet," Richard admitted. "She's been through enough. Finding out the full extent of his manipulation." He trailed off, remembering his daughter's face when she'd read those initial emails. A soft knock interrupted them. Emily stood in the doorway, dressed casually in a sweater and jeans, a far cry from the wedding gown that now hung forgotten in her closet. Her face was pale but composed, one hand resting protectively over her stomach. "I want to know everything," she said firmly. "No more protecting me, Dad. I need to understand exactly who Michael is and what he tried to do to our family." Richard exchanged a glance with Margaret, who quietly excused herself. Once they were alone, he gestured for Emily to sit. "Are you sure?" he asked. "Some truths are harder to bear than uncertainty." Emily's chin lifted in a gesture so reminiscent of her mother that it made Richard's heart ache. "I'm already carrying his child. I deserve to know the whole truth about its father." For the next hour, Richard laid out the complete picture of Michael Crawford's deception, the secret meetings with competitors, the carefully orchestrated accidental encounters with Emily, the detailed plans for using either marriage or scandal to force a change in company control. With each revelation, Emily grew quieter, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "He never loved me," she finally said. "It wasn't a question." "No," Richard confirmed gently, "but that's his loss, not yours." Emily stood abruptly, walking to the window. The city below was coming to life, people hurrying through the snow, carrying Christmas presents and shopping bags. "You know what the worst part is?" she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm almost grateful." Richard raised an eyebrow, waiting for her to continue. "If this hadn't happened, if I hadn't seen who Michael really was, if the wedding hadn't been cancelled, I would have spent my whole life trying to be someone else's version of perfect." She turned to face her father. "I would have married James because it was expected. I would have played the role of society wife because that's what everyone wanted. I would have lost myself completely. And now," a small smile touched Emily's lips, "now I know who I don't want to be." "That's a start, isn't it?" Richard crossed the room to stand beside his daughter. "Your mother would be proud of you, you know. She never cared about society's expectations either. That's why I fell in love with her." "Tell me about when you met," Emily requested softly. "The real story, not the polished version we tell at parties." Richard chuckled. "I was a different man back then, arrogant, focused only on building my empire. Your mother was a waitress at a diner where I used to get coffee. One day, I was being particularly demanding, complaining about the service, the coffee, everything. She looked me right in the eye and said, 'You know, all that money can't buy you happiness, but it sure has bought you a lot of misery.'" Emily laughed, a genuine sound that filled the room. "She really said that?" "Oh yes, and instead of being offended, I was intrigued. Here was someone who saw through all my pretenses and wasn't afraid to call me out. It took months of visiting that diner before she'd even agree to a date." His eyes grew distant with memory. "She taught me that true strength isn't in controlling everything and everyone around you. It's in being vulnerable enough to let love change you." "Is that why you helped James?" Emily asked quietly. Richard looked at his daughter in surprise. "Margaret told me," she explained, "about how you arranged for his family's company to acquire that development project they've been wanting for years. You didn't have to do that." "No," Richard agreed. "But James is a good man who got caught in the crossfire of others' deceptions. He deserved something for his pain." Emily was quiet for a moment. "I did love him, you know. Maybe not enough, or not in the right way, but I did care." "I know, sweetheart. Love isn't always simple or straightforward. Sometimes it's messy and complicated and painful, but that doesn't make it any less real." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the snow fall. Finally, Emily spoke again. "I've made a decision about the baby." Richard turned to her. "Waiting. I want to raise it away from all this." She gestured to the office, the city beyond. "Not forever, but for a while. Somewhere quiet, where I can figure out who I am without everyone's expectations weighing me down." "The house in Vermont," Richard suggested. "Your mother loved it there. It's peaceful, private." Emily nodded. "I thought about that, but I don't want to hide like I'm ashamed. This baby may not have been planned, and its father may not be who I thought he was, but it's still part of me, part of our family." Of course it is. Richard pulled his daughter into a gentle embrace. And we'll love it unconditionally, just like I love you. Even though I messed up. Even though I nearly caused a scandal that could have ruined everything you've built. Richard pulled back to look at his daughter. Emily, listen to me. Buildings can be rebuilt, companies can recover, money can be remade. But family, real, honest, imperfect family, that's irreplaceable. Everything else is just details. Tears spilled down Emily's cheeks. When did you get so wise? Oh, I'm not wise. Richard smiled. I'm just finally learning what your mother tried to teach me all those years ago, that sometimes the best gifts come wrapped in life's biggest disappointments. And that love, real love, isn't about perfection. It's about acceptance, forgiveness, and the courage to begin again. Emily wiped her eyes. So what happens now? Now? Richard looked at the city spread out before them, at the life he'd spent decades building. Now, we write a new story, one where success isn't measured in dollars or social standing, but in moments of genuine connection and growth. And maybe that's the greatest gift this Christmas could give us, the chance to start over, to be better, to love more deeply and truly than before. As if in response to his words, the morning sun broke fully through the clouds, turning the snow-covered city into a dazzling display of light and shadow. In that moment, both father and daughter understood that what had seemed like an ending was really just a beginning. A chance to build something more authentic, more meaningful than all the perfect plans they'd made before. "Merry Christmas, Dad," Emily whispered, squeezing his hand. "Merry Christmas." "Sweetheart," he replied, knowing that sometimes the best presents are the ones we never knew we needed, the gifts of truth, transformation, and the courage to embrace an imperfect but genuine happiness. And in that quiet moment, as snow continued to fall outside and the city began its Christmas celebrations, the Wellingtons understood that their greatest legacy wouldn't be in the buildings they owned or the deals they made, but in the love they chose to give, the forgiveness they offered, and the wisdom to know that true wealth lies not in what we possess, but in who we become when life strips away our illusions and leaves us with nothing but the truth of who we really are. Do you think Emily made the right choice by deciding to start fresh, away from societal expectations? What would you have done in Richard's place when he discovered the truth about Michael? Share your opinion in the comments. We love reading your reflections and thoughts on these stories that make us think about what truly matters in life. If this story touched your heart and made you reflect, give it a like so more people can discover it. See that story on your left? It's just as moving and will keep you on the edge of your seat. I guarantee every twist and every moment of truth will make you feel the same intense emotions you just experienced. Don't miss it. It's one of our most impactful stories. And if you want to keep receiving stories like these that make us believe in the power of true love and personal transformation, subscribe to our channel. Your support allows us to keep sharing these unique and emotional narratives every day.